Okay, I'm introducing somebody who needs no introduction, as we often say. Professor Diarmaid Ferriter, Professor of Modern Irish History in University College Dublin, who has agreed to moderate our first panel. And again, I apologise for not having more time for audience interaction and beg you to ask questions rather than make long speeches. Diarmaid, welcome to the podium.
Thanks very much, Katrina. It's a real pleasure to be here. And I want to thank you too for all that you've done to organise today, and the Academy for hosting it. Katrina and I over many, many years have talked about the importance of historians and archivists working together, particularly when it comes to advocacy. And I'm particularly pleased that we have both historians and archivists here together today, those who are working in archives and those who are using archives. We've also heard from our speakers about funding, about isolation, about neglect, about progress, about access, about privileged access. Other themes that have emerged include sensitivity and trauma, digitisation, the local perspective, the national perspective, and the issue of power. Doors being open, other doors being shut, files that were open that are now closed, and the ethics of publishing sensitive research findings. I was looking at notes yesterday that I had for a speech that I gave to launch Archive Awareness Week some 18 years ago. And I was partly speaking about my own experiences working in Irish archives, largely positive experiences, it has to be said. But there were also controversies at that time about access to sensitive records in the Department of Education. This was in the context of the Commission to Inquire into Child Abuse and how it might proceed with its work and some of the barriers that were being put in place at that time. And it struck me that all of the themes that we've heard about this morning are very long-standing in relation to archives and access and human rights. And we have updated versions of those questions now, but they have been issues for a very long time. And I think we should be grateful that so much has been illuminated by Niamh and Kieran and Maria and Katrina, and I'm sure it has prompted your own observations or thoughts or questions. So we would certainly welcome them now to open up that conversation. And I would ask you to keep your questions brief so that we can get through as much as possible. So I will open it to the floor now to anyone who wishes to begin.
The most important thing is to be aware that there is a problem. And I think once we recognise the problem, whether it's access to diocesan archives, whether it's the Garda archives, whether the convent archives, whatever it might be, and I'm looking at them slightly differently to institutional records, because I think that's a whole kind of thing that's going to be discussed this afternoon anyway. But also like problems such as HSE and their hold on material. So I think the first thing to be aware of is that there is a problem. The second thing is, okay, how do you address a problem, such as the HSE, for instance? I think eventually what must happen is that all those records are taken out of their care and put into a proper archive. And that may need legislation. And I think that that's something that's got to be done. And I don't think it is good enough that records are kept in hospitals and basements and rooms where they are not secure and people can open a door and, you know, show them on TikTok or whatever it is. So those are major problems. I think those organisations need to be aware there's a problem as well, and that historical records are absolutely vital and significant to our understanding of ourselves as a society. I think, you know, with convent archives, I think something is being done. I was talking to my good friend Marianne Cosgrave this morning, and she was telling me about, you know, convents actually meeting to discuss what's going to happen to their archives. I think with the National Archives of Ireland, particularly those departments that are not putting in their records, they need to be held responsible for not putting their records in. It's a legal obligation, and somebody needs to be held to account for it. Yeah. Oh, sorry, God, you haven't heard anything. Do I have to say it all again?
No. We heard everything. I want to get through as much as possible.
Yeah, because So I mean, those are the kind of things. This is not going to happen overnight. And I also think, and I didn't mention it much, but the kind of data protection thing is also something that we archivists and historians need to discuss very, very carefully. There is nothing in data protection legislation that stops historians from doing research on closed archives. There's absolutely, indeed, archivists and historians and the keepers of records are actually advised to work together, and that there should be no tension whatsoever between the sensitivity of records and the use of those records for either sociological or statistical or historical purposes. But we're all afraid. And that's one of the reasons why I think the HSE are terrified of letting anybody see even records that go back to 1835, because they think there's going to be some kind of, somebody's going to come after them and say, oh, you mentioned my great-great-great-great-great-great-great-grandfather, whatever.
Yeah, thanks,
so those things need to be done, I think.
Kieran, have you a view on that?
Oh, you have.
I've got one. Thank you. Yeah, it's an interesting question. I think, firstly, I think it's really important to ask people what the records are for, what the archives are for. I find it stunning the number of places where you get the impression, like being a student in university, that the admins would think it'd be a great place to work if not for the students. Similarly, I think there's a sense that, a lot of archives kind of think that historians and researchers are kind of getting in the way and demanding unreasonable things of them. I was incredibly struck. I'm doing some work on Singapore at the moment. And you've got to remember as well, like Ireland is awash with cash. We have the cash. So I did a load of interviews with people. I got them professionally transcribed. And there was really nowhere for me to deposit those. Singapore, you look up their economic development, they have online recordings and full transcriptions from thousands of policymakers collected from decades ago, just because they take the country seriously. You email, and I asked them, look, I'm looking for material. And they started pointing to me to material that would be relevant in other countries' archives. Again, they just take it seriously. They fund it. And it's a kind of civic pride thing. And there was always an element with Singapore, we need to be better than everyone else. We need to do this properly. Whereas there's definitely in the body politic and at an administrative level this idea that, sure, it's fine, we don't need to do it properly, which is kind of embarrassing. So.
Yeah.
Thanks. I would imagine with the HSC that they need to set up a system where archivists can be employed and there can be an actual archive service, but they would need to survey everything that they have there first. And I think that is only being done as crises emerge instead of being done on a kind of a bottom level up. But I can't really speak for the HSE, but for local authority archive services, I've already pointed out that there are several archives or several local authorities that do not have archivists. I pointed out that the Donegal County Council Archive Service has one member of staff, which is myself, that resources we're drawn into doing many various things. We absolutely do help and assist with researchers and make them accessible. And if you read our access policy, you'll see that we do make records accessible as much as humanly possible, but that there is a huge resource problem and a huge problem in where archives still aren't seen with the same value that perhaps other organisations within local authorities or within the public service generally are regarded. So, but that is a problem that's beyond us. But can I just say that resources is a huge issue, and that requires a lot of lobbying and a lot of work on other people's part.
Katrina, what's top of your wish list?
Well, we've been talking for 30 years about amending the National Archives Act to include other state agencies. That would solve a number of the problems that have been raised today, particularly the HSE, which is really dysfunctional when it comes to taking care of some of the very important records. Just to enlighten all of you about what's going on about that, Philip Cohen asked the question just now. He is the eminent chair of Grange Gorman Histories. And under his auspices, there is a working group which involves the HSE and some members of Grange Gorman Histories in trying to create, first of all, access protocols to their mental hospital records, and secondly, to get an archivist employed to survey the records that exist around the country and get them into proper archival storage. The National Archives has no interest in taking them in. We have raised the question with them and they have said no. But local archives may be interested, some of them are, and that'll be one way of saving these valuable records from destruction. I mean, only in the last day, Jennifer O'Mahony, I think, is here today, and she's working in Waterford and has occasion to try and find the records of St. Otteran's Mental Hospital. They're stored in a building with mould on the inside walls in a corner. They're in imminent danger. Just 2 weeks ago, we have a report in the press about records, I think in Donegal, Niamh, but I could be wrong. Somebody walking into where an old building where mental hospital records are kept and videoing the records and putting the videos online. Now, this is the kind of thing we've been warning the HSE against for 5 years now, and there's still no action. They agreed to the protocol that MRIA referred to this for access, which should be 100 years without restriction, 50 years with, where possible, permission from families, and under 50 years closed. This is best international practice. In fact, it's a little more conservative than best international practice. And the other thing they agreed to was to employ an archivist to oversee the project of preserving and saving the physical records. They ran slap bang into the middle of the recruitment freeze in the HSE and could not hire the archivist, having already asked somebody to take the job, then taken 12 weeks, I think it was, to vet the person, by which time they had another job. They go to the next person on the panel and the recruitment freeze kicks in. The protocol has gone into the labyrinthine decision-making processes of the HSE, which means it could take forever for people to agree to it. I'm despairing, but I think we have to go slightly nuts now, and a whole bunch of us have to get moving on this and really try to get Bernard Gloucester, the CEO of the HSE, to take this seriously, because these records are going to end up in a fire or a flood or something one of these days if we don't move on it.
I'm sure it was done for privacy. I mean, you know, because the children were being boarded out. I'm sure that somebody came up with that decision and decided that they should be just use their initials. I mean, as far as I can remember, they used the names of the people that they were boarded out fully. It's just the children that they initialise. So it must have been for privacy.
It's also an issue that came up in relation to what Maria was saying about the ethics of publishing particular names and that. I mean, that's often a personal decision that has to be made by the scholar, according to how they feel about it. I mean, there are historians who have had access to full names who've decided not to use them because they don't think it's appropriate. So it's not necessarily about what the lawyers might advise. It can also be your own decision.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting. I think the issue, so the Secretary General when I was doing it and the Assistant Secretary who hired me were brilliant, like really curious, really interested. They kind of wanted to see a lot of this stuff, you know, because they're all, you know, it's no fun being forever in the Department of Finance being told that T.K. Whitaker was so much smarter than you are, and if only you were more like T.K. Whitaker, who, you know, carried Ireland on his back through the 20th century. So that was great, but the problem is how do you institutionalise that? How do you make it so that, you know, if another department does it, that you're not just relying on personalities? I don't have a great answer for that, but I think it's something that needs to be given quite a lot of thought. I'm sure your experience as well, like you really, really need that institutional support in terms of getting the file access. I think the FLAC thing, I mean, definitely in terms of the economists, they did not like it. There was also, you know, an advisory group, and on that was former Assistant Secretary for the Department who, like, there was touchiness around, so I thought the decision-making around joining the Euro was particularly poor. There was a lot of touchiness around that kind of thing. Yeah, I think things like advisory groups and stuff, you know, that needs to be taken quite seriously, who's on it, and people maybe reflecting on their roles and being told what their roles are, and that it's about, you know, support and not, you know, avoiding putting pressure. Because ultimately, I think it's the author's book. I think that's the delineation.
Is there an issue as well, Kieran, about, or have you thought about you having privileged access, getting access to files that other historians will not? How do you feel about that, particularly when it comes to the idea of peer review and equality of access. Is that problematic?
Yeah, it's funny. What I thought, I took it very seriously, largely from, first of all, was like, I mean, there's loads of my voice in the book, but was not, when presenting the new information that we don't already have, was not to overtly editorialize, like to try and present the information faithfully. And it was also because, again, I was very aware of that people weren't going to get these, and I'm sure you found this as well, just feeling compelled to get through as many of the historically relevant files as I humanly could in the couple of years. Because again, it's a thing, it's like, again, the end of Raiders of the Lost Ark, it gets sealed up again and no one ever gets to look at it. From a peer review point of view, I hadn't really thought about it that much. Yeah, I think, people form their own opinions. It hasn't come up much, fortunately, which is probably a good sign.
But it's going to come up again, and I mean, it's quite controversial in relation to the proposed public history of the Troubles, or Britain's approach to the Troubles. So it's...
One thing I think is hugely important, and again, I spoke about this already, but is that who is coming up to look at these? Do you know that kind of way? As in, so the alternative, I mean, obviously, in an ideal world, this all gets opened up, people go through it, people get access. The next best thing for me would be that there'd actually be, a raft of, I mean, there are maybe 2 economic historians working in the country in the South. There are so few people who would actually go and look at these. I think it's really, really important that the department actually funded it and facilitated it. I agree with you. I mean, obviously, in an ideal world, that stuff should be materialised. Whether I have legitimated it again, I would look at the power aspect. I mean, I don't blame the department for the stuff not being deposited. I think it's a broader thing. The people who work in the archives in the department would love to see the stuff go into the National Archives. So it's a broader governmental thing. Whether I, as a postdoc, was responsible for legitimating it, I think that the state should probably bear most of the responsibility. I take the point. I'm not dismissing the point, and I agree. I mean, I don't think it's best practice, but it's a hell of a lot better than no one getting into the archive. So,
I know you have a view on that as well. But...
Yeah, and also I just want to comment on something else we talked about. I think privileged access is actually very, very contentious. I think that once, say, a government department, whatever, once they allow privileged access, what they must do is then make those records available and put them into an archive. Absolutely. They should have no conscience about that at all. The problem, of course, Mark, with you're talking about private records. Now, I think the same thing. They should all be in a proper archive as well. But there's very little you can do about the whole nature of the private holdings of these institutions. That's a legal issue, and the government is definitely not going to get involved. I think we'll know more this afternoon, I hope, about that, because these are fundamental records to our identity and our history, and I think must be available to researchers. Can I just make one point here, just going back to my own stuff actually. I was just talking about TUSLA and the fact that they have a lot of local authority records and what can be done. As far as I understand it, and this is what I was told, the records from various local authorities, the TUSLA asked for them, they were handed over, so that there's no legal, as far as I'm aware, there is no legal basis for TUSLA to have these archives. And I also think that if, for heaven's sake, why do they need a digitised set and the original material? And I would say, why are the local authorities not asking for those records back? And that's a place to start. Okay. And that's an easy place to start.
Katrina, you want to come in there?
There's a very quick solution to what happened with Kieran's access. I think you consulted 5,000 files out of a potential 100,000. The files were transported, as we understand, certainly at the beginning, to the National Archives for you to consult. They should have kept them. Just keep them where they are. Yeah, but you know what I mean? And in that situation, anybody who wanted to read your book and go in and look at your footnotes and say, here's the file, would get it.
Yeah,
it's not a vast quantity of stuff.
No, and I think as well that issue that I kind of brought up, that the other 95,000 that are less historically important, then you don't have to prioritise those so much. You had literally the filtration process was actually a very valuable service that then is then squandered. should have taken away, because it means someone else isn't going to get to go filter through 100,000 files. So I thought that, yeah, I'd agree.
I mean, bring in more voices on the floor here, because there's...
I know with the hospital files, the Data Protection Commissioner is actually undertaking an investigation at the moment to see what was looked at and what was revealed online. And HSE is expecting a massive fine for that, because they have made those, those records weren't kept securely. I think a lot of the institutional records probably are kept securely, but we don't have access to them. And I think that that's, again, a topic that will be covered much more fully this afternoon. Yeah. That's, it just brings back memories, really. When we were doing the Women's History Project, we went around to a lot of the diocesan archives, and this was in the late 1990s, before various scandals had come to light, or what I should say, really, various aspects of our history had been brought to light. And it amused me at the time, but every diocesan archive we went into, we were asked to, in a jokey kind of way, and in a kind of roundabout way, let's hope you don't discover any scandals. And we kind of didn't take it seriously. Sure, if we only knew what was going to come, from all of these records. But with the diocesan archives, when we were looking at them, and even with them when Mary and myself were working on the marriage book, there were diocesan archives we were in where we were not allowed to look at anything relating to marriage, even going back to the 17th, 18th centuries. They did not want us to see it. And you cannot actually find annulment cases. I have one case in this Sex and Intimacy book, which is an annulment case that I found the Dublin Diocesan Archives, and which is absolutely horrendous in terms of what they put the woman through. But it is the only annulment case I have come across in over 40 years of research in religious or diocesan archives. But of course there are other records like that in these archives, but we're not allowed to see them.
I just say that something, I'm abusing my position a little here. One of the outcomes of today is to be a series of questions and recommendations. And what you've just asked will form part of that. Also, the very many questions that MRIA has raised in her fascinating paper, and the issues that Niamh brought up, and I'm sure we'll have plenty more from this afternoon. But the point is, every now and again there's a panic about archives, and a lot of it has come from the terrible commissions of inquiry that are still under scrutiny by people here today, and we'll hear more about that in the afternoon. But I suppose what today is opening up is the broader question of access to archives, even down to things like closing the National Archives for lunch. I didn't realise that had started. That's really going backwards. But all of these things become the questions that we will be asking. You can always write letters to the paper. You can write to the Minister for Culture, Media, Sport, etc., Catherine Martin, who is in charge of the National Archives, advocating for the National Archives Act to be amended properly to include all the public records that need to be in there. As regards the Church, we are stuck because the government and the Church itself regard their records as private records. There is a very good case to be made to say that they are actually state records, given that the Catholic Church in Ireland ran health, education and so-called welfare in these institutions since the foundation of the state with the full blessing of the state. That would take a lot of guts and gumption on the part of politicians and public servants to admit that that might be true. Otherwise, it will be coaxing and cajoling and attempting to get material for the good of people who need to get hold of it. In other words, relying on the goodwill of those who have custody of these records. But thank you for asking the question, what can you do? It's so nice to hear that. Very often not much happens for long periods of time and then we get into a panic again. Sorry, Diarmaid, I did abuse myself.
Oh, but those in university history departments in particular have to stress the importance of archives, preservation of material and access to material finding its way into the official publications of universities and the recommendations from their own departments, or the research from their own departments that might find their way into end-of-year reports or president's reports, that such access is seen as intrinsic to the mission of the university. And it's not just relevant to history. Clearly, it's relevant to a whole host of disciplines within a university.
Can I just say as well that I don't know if this is working. Yeah, in terms of local authority archives, if there are archives that you really want to see and you're not being provided access to them, either because there's no archivist, there's no archive service, you have to go to that local authority. You have to go to the chief executive, first port of call, and say this is why you want the archives, and this is the situation. It is under the Local Government Act 2001 that you're actually entitled to that access. So you have to start by lobbying locally as well as nationally.
In terms of GDPR and data protection, archivists must know what the situation is. And if they don't know, they need to find out, they need to be trained, just as I think that historians also need to be trained in what data protection actually means, and it's something we should be teaching our students. But there are many people I've come across in archives who will not let me see things because of data protection, and I make an argument and I say it's not covered because of this or that or whatever, or the legislation allows me to look at it. It doesn't make any difference. If they say no, it's a no. So I don't think it's enough to just say that archivists aren't legal experts. None of us, I'm not a legal expert, but I ask people, archivists and legal people all the time, what's the situation? And I'm getting different answers. And I think that's also very confusing. But I think there is also a very basic level at which we can understand that archivists and historians work together within the legislation to allow research, good research that doesn't identify individuals or living individuals in any way. It's very feasible, it's very doable, and it's fear that stops, I think, a lot of archivists from letting researchers like myself look at this material.
Well, I take that as a call for action rather than a specific question to our panellists, because I think the point is very well made, and it would seem, I think, to most of us here that this is one of the purposes of today is to try and achieve that kind of resolve and cooperation.
Totally in keeping with our broader protection of our heritage of all types. So, I don't think it's not a massive surprise, unfortunately.
We're going to break for lunch now. We will be resuming at 2 o'clock, and obviously plenty more to discuss. Would you just join me in showing your appreciation for our four speakers this morning? Thank you.